Thank you. So, hello everyone. Thank you very much for being here to listen to me, and thank you, Sterling, Jocelyn, and the volunteers from Route de l'Orient for your hard work. It's a pleasure to be here, my first academic visit to the lovely city of Paris. I'm quite excited to be here, and thank you all for being here to listen to me today. So the subject is, of course, the Meccan sanctuary, its patronage during the Abbasid period, but there's a background to it. So I am going to give you an overview of the problems associated or the questions associated with the study of the Meccan sanctuary and so on and so forth. So there are several issues that need to be addressed by historians of early Islam when studying the Mecca, the Kaaba, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and so on and so forth. And one of them is the emergence of Mecca as the most sacred site in Islam. So that's the first question. The second question is the relationship between Kaaba or Mecca or the Hajj or the pilgrimage and political power. So how political authorities patronized Mecca, what role they played in the development of the sanctity of Mecca, of the pilgrimage rituals and everything, and vice versa. How they used the sanctity of Mecca to buy political legitimacy for themselves. And the third question is the development of pilgrimage rituals. How pilgrimage rituals developed over time. Were they the way we know them today from the beginning, or was there some development over the course of time? So these are the questions that need to be addressed in the study of the Kaaba, pilgrimage, Mecca. And we have a body of evidence to actually make use of when studying, addressing these questions. This actually includes historical reports and literary sources, chronicles, so on and so forth, the Quran itself, legal and hadith compendia, ancient poetry, so-called non-Muslim sources from early Islam, as well as epigraphy and archaeology. But obviously, as you all know, it's impossible to do archaeology in Mecca for obvious reasons. It's sacred. You can't just go and dig in the Haram area. Other than the Haram area, most parts of Mecca have been rebuilt over the course of time and everything. So archaeology is out of the question. But I'm going to give you, there isn't much time, but I'm going to give you a foretaste of some other specimens here, pieces of evidence that I have actually included here. So my point of departure, or rather my point of arrival, because this is going to be at the end of the talk, will be these inscriptions from Mecca. So I have included 3 of them here. There are 5 of them, 2 more pillars, columns like the one on the left, as well as these 2 other inscriptions. The columns come from the Haram area. The other 2 inscriptions are foundation inscriptions of a mosque, Masjid al-Bay'a, which is still standing actually in Mecca, which is not very far from the Haram area and was built by the Caliph al-Mansur, as you can see in the inscriptions. But yeah, the resolution is not very high, I'm afraid, but it's mentioned there. And we'll get back to them later on. So these were discovered and also published. Well, the columns actually, the pillars, were well known over the course of time because they were hidden in plain sight, so to speak. But the problem was that people who were in Saudi Arabia, who went there, never thought of them as new finds. Western scholars couldn't go to Mecca to find them. So that was the problem. So they have only ever appeared in catalogs or even exhibition catalogs, including inscriptions from Mecca. They have never been presented, billed as new finds. So many scholars don't actually know about them. I have talked to many scholars, specialists in the West about these pillars. Only a handful of them, maybe 2 or 3 knew of them, as well as these 2 inscriptions, which I believe were found more recently, maybe by Al-Harathi, the Saudi epigraphist, Nasr ibn Ali Al-Harathi, if I remember correctly. And they have also been published, but again, in catalogs of the inscriptions from the region. So it's not, they never were actually published alone as a standalone publication. And because of that, very few people know about them. But they're very important. But I'm going to actually contextualize part of this talk, not only give you the contents of the inscriptions and their importance, but also contextualize the erection of these inscriptions and the buildings on which these inscriptions have been found. So let us start with the status of the Meccan sanctuary vis-a-vis Jerusalem in early Islam. So I want to give you a story about the rivalry between Mecca and Jerusalem in early Islam for the status of the most sacred place in Islam. So Mecca is obvious. So Mecca, as you know, is in the Quran is said to be an Abrahamic foundation, founded by Abraham and Ishmael. And the Meccans, or at least the Quran's audience, considered themselves, it seems, to be descendants of Abraham. This is very well established in later post-Quranic material that the people or the Arabs are descendants of Ishmael and Abraham. But some scholars have questioned whether the Quran also considers its audience and its prophet, its messenger, to be descendants of Abraham. But it does, actually. And the evidence is here, not explicitly, but implicitly. So the first one, the second verse I've quoted here actually occurs in the middle of the story of Abraham and Ishmael's foundation of the Kaaba in the Quran. And they're hoping, they are praying to God to raise a nation from their progeny and send a messenger to them, send a prophet to them. And then again, in the other verse, up there, you have a reference to Quran's own messenger, meaning Muhammad, who is actually described using the very same terminology. In other words, the Quran is implying that the messenger that Abraham and Ishmael were praying for is Muhammad, none other than Muhammad himself. And that also implies, because they're actually praying for this messenger to be from their descendants, implies that this messenger is that Muhammad and his people are descendants of Abraham and Ishmael. So that question is solved now. And the Meccan sanctuaries, of course, believed to have been, also in the Quran, but also later Muslim sources, is said to have been founded by Abraham and Ishmael. So Abraham and Ishmael are the founders of the Meccan sanctuary, and Muhammad's people, Muhammad and his people, are now caretakers of the sanctuary. In other words, they are this is actually something they are inheriting from Abraham and Ishmael. And, well, this is actually, well, some description of the Kaaba before on the eve of Islam from Al-Azraq's Akhbar Mecca. It says that there are two strands of traditions. One says that there were idols actually in Mecca. Mecca was turned into an idol house. The other one actually says that there were no idols there, but only likenesses of Jesus and Mary. So that also has got some bearing on the important question of the religious situation in Arabia and Mecca on the eve of Islam. And so Kaaba is an Abrahamic foundation, and in other words, the descendants of Abraham, the people of the audience of the Quran who are now the caretakers in charge of Kaaba and the Mecca and the sanctuary, they are basically taking care of their inheritance. But this leaves a question. What about Jerusalem? So, of course, Jerusalem is the holy sanctuary of the Jews, and the Jews are descendants of Abraham through Isaac. So they're cousins of Muhammad and his people. So Jerusalem is the inheritance, Abrahamic inheritance of the Israelites, while Mecca and the Kaaba are the Abrahamic inheritance of the Muslims. But the Quran is full of very long litanies of grievances against Jews and Israelites. You were sinful, you worshipped the golden calf, you killed the prophets that God sent to you and everything. So from the point of view of the Quran, it seems Israel was God's elect, but has now fallen from divine favor. These are some of the verses. So the first one actually is a verse, some words put into the mouth of Abraham. God says to Abraham, I'm appointing you a leader for the people. And then Abraham inquires, so what about my progeny? God says, my covenant does not extend to the evil-doing party. So in other words, the Quran is implying here that, well, Abraham, we know you're a good guy, also your descendants, we're going to take care of them, but so only insofar as they are righteous people. If they start behaving sinfully, they will not be included in God's covenant anymore. So God's covenant in the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible is not so conditional, but in the Quran it's conditional. And the evidence is actually here. There's another verse where the Quran explicitly quotes the Psalms. So this is the only explicit quotation in the Quran from another book, from another composition. And the conditional clause does not actually exist as such in the Psalms, but does exist in the Quran. So the Quran is quoting the Psalms, but adding a conditional clause to it. So you Jews will only be inheriting be included in God's covenant in so long as you behave righteously. If you behave sinfully, you fall from divine grace. And then it adds that, well, the land will be inherited by my righteous servants. So who are God's righteous servants now? If Jews have been behaving sinfully all this while, the implication is that now the Muslims, Muhammad and his people, as his believers, are now the righteous party. So it seems that the Quran is implying that the Muslims are going to inherit not only their share of Abraham's heritage, but also the Jews' share of Abraham's heritage, meaning the Holy Land and Jerusalem. So both Jerusalem and Mecca, because of this, are very holy for Islam, for earliest Islam, for nascent Islam. And already, this is my opinion, beginning with the year 629, the Muslims actually start launching raids in the direction of Palestine. And I think the reason for that is they actually want to make good on this claim. They want to conquer Jerusalem. And they do eventually, some 10 years later. And sort of the problem is sort of becomes moot there. The question becomes moot there because now the Muslims own both Jerusalem and Mecca, and both are sacred sites for them. So there's no problem there. You can venerate either one or both or whatever. There's no problem. But eventually, there emerges a problem, the Second Civil War. And the Second Civil War divides the community into multiple camps. And as you can see in this map, one of these camps, led by Abdullah ibn Zubayr, is in control of Mecca, the blue part, in the Hijaz. You see, Ibn Zubayr is in control of Mecca, while the Umayyads are in the control of that other part, including Jerusalem, and generally Asham. So this creates some problems, especially during the pilgrimage season. So Ibn Zubayr is making very good use of the fact that he's in control of Mecca. So he tries to actually use this for propaganda purposes, while on the other hand, the Umayyads are in Syria, so they're not in charge of the pilgrimage to Mecca. So they try to set up Jerusalem as an alternative to Mecca. And some scholars have actually cast doubt on this, on this statement by the sources that Abdul Malik actually tried to route the pilgrimage from Mecca to Jerusalem. I believe it's not actually so much as routing the pilgrimage from Mecca to Jerusalem, but patronizing one of the two very holy sites of Islam at the expense of the other. So Abdul Malik is just patronizing Jerusalem, but abandoning Mecca because he's not in control of Mecca. That's it. It's not like he's actually setting up Jerusalem as a new thing against Mecca. These are early on both very holy sites, maybe just as holy, the both of them, for the early community. And is patronizing one of these two sites by setting up the Dome of the Rock and the rituals, the pilgrimage rituals, the Dome of the Rock, described in literary sources and our sources. He's setting up this as an alternative, but it's nothing new. It's just he's patronizing one of the two at the expense of the other. And when eventually, so this brings about a huge conflict during the Second Civil War, but eventually, when the Civil War ends, again, the questions becomes moot because the Umayyads are now in control of both holy sites, and there is no point for them taking up cudgels against Mecca because Mecca's holy status is well established, and they wouldn't gain anything by actually trying to detract from Mecca's holy status. So after the Civil War, they again start patronizing both holy sites. And you can see the evidence here. One of the first things that Abdul Malik does, as evidenced by this inscription, graffiti here, actually published 15 years ago, again by Al-Harithi. It actually refers to Abdul Malik's rebuilding of reconstruction of the Meccan sanctuary, of the Kaaba, and Al-Masjid al-Haram. Why? Because it's been damaged during the Civil War, but also, and I think even more importantly, because in the course of the Civil War, Ibn Zubayr has made changes to the exterior, completely. He has actually demolished the sanctuary, the Kaaba, and rebuilt it along new lines. So Abdul Malik undoes all of his actually changes to the Kaaba. So there's also some question of political authority and its relationship with the Meccan sanctuary here. So people try to actually stake a claim to being the person who has the right to tell people how the things should be by making changes to the Kaaba. And the other one, this continues through to the end of the Umayyad period. The other one is actually an inscription dating to the reign of Hisham from Darb Zubayda. And also attests his actual building activity on Darb Zubayda and development of the Hajj route. And then the passage there is actually from literary source, evidencing Hisham's further patronage during one of his pilgrimages to Mecca. So this is all going on, but they are actually bestowing generously both on Jerusalem and Mecca, the Umayyads. It continues, actually. So again, this is a reference to presumably the papyrus fragment over there on the right refers to actually the caliph, presumably Hisham. It's undated, but on paleographic and other grounds, and probably also based on the people mentioned in it, we can more or less assume that it was during or around the time of the reign of Hisham. It actually refers to the commander of the believers authorizing the pilgrimage to Mecca, the caliph authorizing the pilgrimage to Mecca. And then this graffiti over there to the left is also actually a reference to the pilgrimage undertaken by Hisham's elder brother, the Caliph Sulaiman. And so the two actually sanctuaries in this period, the Umayyads are generously bestowing on Mecca, but the two sanctuaries, Mecca and Jerusalem, sort of stand on equal footing in this period, as evidenced by this line from Al-Farazdak, the middle line, وَبَيْتَانْ بَيْتُ اللَّهِ نَحْنُ وَلَاتُهُ وَبَيْتٌ بَعَلَى إِلِيَا مُشَرَّف. And two sanctuaries, of one of which we are caretakers, and the other one at the summit of Ilia, Jerusalem, venerated. So he's putting the two sanctuaries, Mecca and Jerusalem, the Temple Mount and Kaaba, on the same pedestal. So this is what happens in the Umayyad period. But beginning with the Abbasids remove the base of power from Syria to Iraq. They have no actually interest in patronizing Jerusalem anymore. They stop spending on Jerusalem. After shortly before the Abbasid revolution, an earthquake destroys Al-Aqsa mosque in Jerusalem, and then on a visit, Al-Mansur, when he is asked to actually rebuild the mosque, he says, I don't have the money. And when people insist that the mosque be rebuilt, he actually has the silver coating of the doors of the mosque melted down, strikes coins using that silver, and then pays for the cost of rebuilding the Al-Aqsa mosque with those coins. But in Mecca, it's the exact opposite. The development of Darb Zubayda, very generously. Every single Abbasid prince, member of the royal family, and caliph actually bestows very generously on the Darb Zubayda. They even seem to be encouraging people to go on pilgrimage. When they actually appear in Mecca on pilgrimage, they disperse money to the pilgrims and everything. So they are actually start patronizing one of the two sanctuaries at the expense of the other. And here is where Mecca actually takes over, and this race takes over Jerusalem for the status of most sacred in early Islam. Jerusalem is relegated to backwater. Even it only actually acquires newfound importance after the First Crusade. So every single actually specimen from the Fada'il al-Quds literature we have is dated to after the First Crusade. And the inscriptions. And then the third Abbasid Caliph al-Mahdi actually erects 3 columns and the Meccan sanctuary in the Haram area in Masjid al-Haram. And this is one of them. I'm giving you only one of them because the other 2 are actually ancillary to this. So 2 of these 3 inscriptions on columns are on 2 pillars actually, which are supposed to be way markers. 2 columns standing next to each other, and they're supposed to be way markers as indicated by the contents of the inscription. So أمر عبد الله محمد المهدي أمير المؤمنين بإقامة هاتين الأسطوانتين علما للطريق رسول الله للسفر ليتأسى به حج بيت الله وأماره. So these 2 pillars were erected on the orders of the Caliph al-Mahdi so that pilgrims to the house of God, and pilgrims on Hajj and Umrah, would actually know the path that the Prophet took while going to the Safa from Mecca. You circumambulate the Kaaba during the ritual, and then you go to Safa and Marwa, and there is some debate about which route to take, as evidenced by literary sources here. There's a discussion about which door to exit from. And then it seems that the Caliph is actually intervening in this. So the Caliph is telling people that this is the path you need to take. He's trying to regularize the Hajj rituals, as evidenced by these inscriptions. So that's where we have evidence of political power intersecting with religious, with things religious and the performance of the Hajj rituals in particular. So this is basically how eventually Mecca appears as the most sacred site in Islam with this patronage, and how the rituals became more and more regularized thanks to political authorities. But I'm going to give you very briefly before concluding a glimpse of the other inscription as well. The other inscriptions are from a mosque nearby called Masjid al-Bay'a, the Mosque of Allegiance, built by the second Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur to commemorate the Pledge of Allegiance by the Medinians to Muhammad on the eve of his migration to Medina. So his migration to Medina was facilitated after this Pledge of Allegiance, and the story is this mosque was built to commemorate that actually site by al-Mansur, and the inscription gives the story of that event and the role that the Caliph's ancestor Al-Abbas played in the event. So أمر عبد الله أمير المؤمنين ببنيان هذا المسجد مسجد البيئة التي كانت أول بيئة بويا بها رسول الله صلى الله عليه. عقده العباس ابن عبد المطلب تلك الليلة لرسول الله على الأنصار في هذا المسجد أن يصدقوا رسول الله عليه بما جاءهم به من الله وأن يسمعوا له ويطيعوا ويمنعوا مما يمنعوا منه أنفسهم وأبنائهم, and so on and so forth. This is a mosque built on the orders of the Caliph al-Mansur, Abdullah Amir al-Mu'minin al-Mansur, and then the other one is dated 144. And this is the Masjid al-Bay'a where the Ansar, the Medinians, the Medinan helpers pledged allegiance to Muhammad. And this pledge of allegiance, the sealing of this allegiance, was facilitated by the guy's great-grandfather, Al-Abbas. So this is also has got important bearing on the Abbasids' patronage of not only the holy sanctuary, but also prophetic biography. So many people, specialists in the study of prophetic biography, the life of Muhammad, biography of Muhammad, have speculated on the role that the Abbasids and political power more generally played in the development of prophetic biography. But now we have very material evidence for that in the form of these inscriptions. They actually make it crystal clear that the Abbasids were patronizing sites of memory in Mecca associated with the Prophet, and they were spending generously on them, and that they were trying to magnify the role of their own ancestors and in the origins of Islam. So thank you very much for your attention.